In this episode, we're going to take the big, slightly intimidating idea of the QSA blueprint and make it feel like a map you can actually use, not a wall of words you have to survive. If you are new to this world, it can feel like everyone else already knows the secret language, and you are just trying to figure out what the test is even trying to measure. The good news is that the blueprint is not a trick, and it is not a mystery document written to confuse you. It is simply the exam's promise about what matters, what does not matter, and how the certification expects you to think. When you learn to read that promise correctly, you stop studying random PCI topics and start studying the exact skills the exam is built to reward. By the end, you should feel like you can look at the blueprint and immediately see what to focus on, what to practice, and how to keep your studying from drifting into noise. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first mindset shift is understanding what a blueprint really is, because a lot of people treat it like a table of contents or a checklist of terms to memorize. A blueprint is closer to a job description written in exam language, because it tells you which capabilities are being tested and how those capabilities are grouped. That means the blueprint is less about vocabulary and more about demonstrating judgment, sequencing, and reasoning. Even when the exam asks something that looks like a definition question, it usually cares about whether you know how that definition changes a decision you would make as an assessor. For example, the blueprint might not say memorize every PCI requirement number, but it will strongly imply you need to recognize how scoping decisions affect everything else you do. When you approach the blueprint as a skills map, you stop chasing trivia and start building a small set of repeatable thinking patterns that you can apply across many different questions. Now let's ground the conversation in what this certification is about at a high level, because that helps the blueprint make sense. A qualified security assessor, QSA, is not primarily a technician, and it is not primarily a compliance clerk either, even though parts of the work touch both. The QSA role is about making defensible, evidence-based statements about whether an organization meets the PCI expectations for protecting payment data. That word defensible matters, because the exam is not just asking what you personally think is secure. It is testing whether you can interpret requirements, evaluate evidence, and reach conclusions that would hold up under scrutiny. So when you read the blueprint, look for the places where it is testing your ability to judge scope, judge evidence quality, and judge whether something meets an intent, not just a literal checkbox. The blueprint is essentially asking, can you think like someone who must be accurate, fair, and consistent under pressure? When learners say they want to crack the blueprint, what they usually mean is that they want a shortcut, like a hidden list of exact questions. That is not how this kind of exam works, and it is better that it does not, because the real role requires adaptability. The blueprint is more like a set of lanes on a highway, and the exam will drive you through those lanes in different ways. Two questions might look different on the surface, but they are really testing the same lane, like evidence evaluation or scoping boundaries. Your job is to learn to recognize the lane quickly, because that tells you what thinking tool to use. This is why people who only memorize facts often feel surprised, while people who practice the underlying reasoning feel calm, even when the question is unfamiliar. Unlocking what really counts means identifying the core moves the exam rewards, then practicing those moves until they feel natural. One practical way to read the blueprint is to scan for themes that appear early and then keep reappearing, because repeated themes are the backbone of the exam. In a QSA world, scope is one of those themes, because scope drives which systems are in play, which controls apply, and which evidence is relevant. Another recurring theme is evidence quality, because you are not just hearing a story, you are verifying claims with artifacts, observations, and interviews. Another is the difference between intent and implementation, because compliance is not only about whether a control exists, but whether it actually reduces risk in a meaningful way. When you see those themes, treat them as skills you will carry from one domain to the next rather than separate topics. The blueprint is not telling you to learn 20 unrelated chapters. It is telling you to master a few critical lenses and apply them everywhere. It also helps to understand how exam blueprints usually express priority without saying it directly. Some blueprints include weights, percentages, or emphasis statements. But even if you do not see numbers, you can still detect priority by noticing which ideas have more detailed subpoints. The more the blueprint breaks a topic into specific tasks, the more likely the exam expects you to do that task, not just recognize a word. If a section talks about identifying scope, validating segmentation, and confirming data flows, that signals action verbs, not passive knowledge. Action verbs are gold because they tell you what the exam wants you to be able to do mentally in the moment. In your studying, translate those action verbs into practice prompts, like how would I determine scope from a messy environment description, or how would I decide whether evidence is strong enough to support a conclusion. That is how you align your brain with the exam's reward system. A common misconception is that cracking the blueprint means building a perfect study schedule first, but the better sequence is the opposite. First, you learn what the blueprint values. Then you design a schedule that practices those values repeatedly. If you start with a schedule before you understand the blueprint, you can end up spending weeks reading material that feels productive but does not build exam-ready judgment. Beginners are especially vulnerable to this because reading feels like progress, but exams that test reasoning require active application. The blueprint is trying to pull you away from passive familiarity and toward confident decision-making. So even in early study sessions, when you are still learning terms, you want to keep asking yourself what decision this term affects. If a term never changes a decision, it is probably not central to what really counts. Another way to unlock what matters is to notice the difference between primary concepts and supporting concepts. Primary concepts are the ones that, if you misunderstand them, everything else breaks, like scope, cardholder data, environment boundaries, and what counts as evidence. Supporting concepts are still important, but they exist to help you execute the primary concepts, like understanding common network components or basic access control ideas. The exam will absolutely test supporting concepts, but usually as part of a scenario where you have to apply them to a primary concept. For example, you might be asked about segmentation not as a networking trivia question, but as a scoping decision that changes what must be assessed. If you study in layers, you start with primary concepts until they are stable, then you build supporting concepts underneath them. That structure keeps you from drowning in details and helps you stay aligned to what really counts. It is also worth understanding that the blueprint is not only measuring knowledge, it is measuring professional posture. The QSA mindset is cautious but not paralyzed, confident but not arrogant, and always anchored to evidence. That posture shows up in the kinds of answer choices the exam offers, because there will often be options that sound decisive but are unsupported. There may also be options that sound safe but avoid making the required assessment call. The blueprint is basically training you to take responsibility for making a conclusion when the evidence supports it, and to refuse to overstate certainty when it does not. That is why terms like validate, confirm, verify, and document matter so much, because they describe a discipline of thinking. When you practice questions, pay attention to whether you are choosing answers because they sound strong or because they reflect that disciplined posture. A powerful method for blueprint mastery is building what I like to call mental anchors, not in the sense of gimmicks, but in the sense of repeatable questions you ask yourself. When you see any problem, you can ask, what is in scope? What data is at risk? What requirement intent is relevant? And what evidence would prove the claim? These anchors keep you from panicking because they give you a structured way to approach unfamiliar wording. They also map directly to what the blueprint is trying to measure because it is essentially a list of recurring professional questions a QSA should ask. If you practice those internal questions every time you study, you start to think in the exam's language without having to force it. Over time, you will notice that many questions are just variations of the same underlying decision, wrapped in different details. As you start working with the blueprint, be careful about a trap that hits beginners hard, which is assuming the exam rewards the most secure answer rather than the most correct assessment answer. Sometimes those overlap, but sometimes they do not, because a QSA is not always designing the perfect future system. They are evaluating the current environment against requirements. The exam often tests whether you can separate what you wish were true from what you can verify. So an answer that says implement a new control might sound security forward, but if the question is asking what evidence is needed today, that answer misses the point. The blueprint's focus on assessment means you should practice distinguishing improvement recommendations from assessment conclusions. In your head, learn to ask whether the question is about advising, verifying, or reporting, because each of those aligns to different blueprint skills. Another key unlock is understanding how the blueprint connects concepts rather than isolating them. Scope is connected to data flow is connected to system boundaries. Boundaries are connected to segmentation, and segmentation is connected to sampling and evidence strategy. When you see the blueprint as a web, you stop studying topics in isolation and you start studying how one decision forces downstream consequences. That is exactly how real assessments work, and it is also how exam writers create questions that test judgment. For example, if segmentation is weak, your scope may expand, which changes how much evidence you need, which changes how you write conclusions. The blueprint is not explicitly drawing that flowchart for you, but it is implying it through the way the topics are ordered and repeated. Your job is to build that flow in your own mind, because it becomes your navigation system on test day. Let's talk about what it means to unlock what really counts in terms of day-to-day study behavior, because this is where many people waste time. When you read a section or listen to a lesson, do not only try to remember it, try to do something with it, like explain it in your own words, and then apply it to a simple example. A beginner-friendly example might be a small business with a point-of-sale system, a back-office computer, and a Wi-Fi network. Your job is not to configure anything, but to think like an assessor. Where could card data travel? Which systems touch it? And what boundaries separate those systems from everything else? That kind of thinking turns passive knowledge into active skill, and it aligns tightly to the blueprint. You can do this without labs, without tools, and without deep technical work, because the point is the reasoning, not the implementation. Over time, you will find that you are studying fewer facts, but you are retaining more usable understanding. Finally, remember that the blueprint is not your enemy, and it is not a hurdle you jump once and forget. It is the exam's contract and the profession's compass, and you can keep using it to check whether your learning is still on track. When you feel overwhelmed, return to the blueprint and ask what outcomes it is demanding, because that will help you cut away extra material that is not buying you points. When you feel confident, return to the blueprint and ask whether you can actually perform its action verbs in your head, because that will reveal any gaps you are masking with familiarity. This is how you make your studying efficient and calm, especially as a beginner who is building a new mental framework from scratch. The real win is not just passing the exam, but training your mind to think in a consistent, defensible way that matches what the role expects. That is what cracking the blueprint really means, and when you get that, you have unlocked what really counts.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.